Light gathers in a single place and holds there, contained within glass and fabric, steady enough to resist the movement of the night beyond it. The room around it remains unchanged, shaped by repetition rather than design, surfaces worn smooth by use, objects placed with a care that no longer requires attention. Paper rests in quiet alignment, edges meeting without resistance, while ink waits undisturbed, its surface unbroken. Nothing here suggests urgency. Only a condition of continuation persists, where each element remains ready, not for what has happened, but for what will be asked of it again. As these two conditions remain quietly side by side, you might take a moment to subscribe, but only if this kind of calm, reflective history is something you find yourself returning to. And let us know where you're listening from, or which moment stays with you the most. You're listening to Echoes of War. Inside a building set back from the street, light remains where it otherwise would not. It gathers in a single room, contained within drawn curtains and narrow frames, casting a steady glow across surfaces that have already settled into the repetition of use. A desk stands near the center, its edges worn smooth by habit rather than age. Papers rest in measured stacks, aligned with care that suggests not perfection, but necessity. Ink sits ready, undisturbed, its surface still enough to reflect the faint outline of the lamp above it. There is no sense of urgency here, only continuation. The room does not change quickly. It resists interruption in the way that places shaped by routine often do. Even the smallest movements seem to occur within an established pattern, as though each action has already been performed countless times before, and will be performed again in much the same way. A hand reaches across the desk, not hurried, not hesitant, but practiced. Paper shifts slightly beneath the pressure, sliding into position without resistance. The sound is quiet, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding stillness, yet it carries with it a kind of permanence. Once moved, it will not return to where it was. Beyond the walls, the city holds its own rhythm, one that does not fully enter this room but cannot be entirely kept out. Footsteps pass at intervals, their pace unremarkable, their direction uncertain. Doors open and close somewhere beyond sight, each movement contained within its own space, separate and complete. Nothing lingers. Nothing gathers. The night allows for movement without attention, for presence without recognition. It creates a condition in which things can exist without being fully seen. At the desk, the work continues without interruption. The act itself is simple, almost unremarkable when taken on its own. A document is lifted, examined, and set down again with a precision that does not require thought. Ink meets paper in measured lines, each mark placed exactly where it is expected to be. There is no variation in the motion, no hesitation that would suggest uncertainty. The process has been repeated enough times that it no longer asks for decision. It asks only for continuation. The light remains steady, though the hour moves forward. It does not flicker or dim, and because of this, the passage of time becomes less visible. Without the change of light, there is little to indicate how long the work has continued or how long it will continue still. The room exists outside of the shifting patterns of the night, held in a kind of suspension where beginning and ending lose their clarity. Only the sequence of actions remains, each one following the last without interruption or reflection. Nothing here announces itself as significant. The desk is not extraordinary. The papers carry no visible weight beyond their form. The hand that moves between them does so without emphasis, guided more by familiarity than intention. And yet, within this quiet repetition, something begins to gather, not as an event, not as a moment, but as a condition. It is not yet defined, not yet visible in any single action. It exists only in the persistence of the process, in the way each movement continues without deviation, as though guided by something that does not need to be spoken aloud. Outside, the night deepens without change. The distant sound of the train has long since faded, leaving behind a silence that feels complete rather than empty. The city remains, but it has withdrawn into itself, its presence reduced to small, intermittent traces that no longer reach the room. What remains is contained within these walls: light, paper, ink, and the quiet continuation of work that does not pause to consider its place in anything larger. For now, there is only this: the desk, the paper, the steady motion of a hand that continues, line after line, without interruption, and the quiet sense that something, though not yet visible, is already in motion. The room holds its shape as the night moves forward, unchanged in its arrangement, yet subtly altered in its weight. Time does not pass here in visible increments. It gathers instead, settling into the edges of objects, into the stillness between movements, into the quiet space where one action ends and another begins. The lamp continues to cast its steady light, and in that constancy, it becomes difficult to measure how long the work has continued or how long it has yet to go. There is no marker to follow, only repetition. The papers on the desk shift gradually, though not in a way that draws attention. A finished document is set aside. Another takes its place. The motion is smooth, uninterrupted, as if guided by a rhythm that no longer requires thought. Ink touches paper again, forming lines that remain consistent in their shape and spacing, each mark carrying the same quiet authority as the last. There is no pause between them, no visible consideration, only continuation, as though the act itself has become detached from the need to decide. Beyond the drawn curtains, something has begun to change, though it does not enter the room all at once. It begins as a presence rather than a sound, a faint disturbance in the stillness of the street, subtle enough that it could be overlooked if not for its persistence. Footsteps, at first isolated, begin to repeat. They do not pass by and disappear as they did before. They gather. They remain. The rhythm shifts from movement to waiting, though the distinction is not immediately clear. The room does not respond. It remains contained, its boundaries holding firm against what exists beyond them. And yet, the outside begins to press inward, not physically, but through the quiet awareness that something is forming just beyond sight. The kind of awareness that does not interrupt the work, but changes the way it is held. The hand continues to move across the paper, but the space around it feels less isolated, less separate from the world beyond the walls. There is no direct connection yet, no voices reaching through the glass, no movement that forces acknowledgement. Only the sense that the night is no longer empty in the way it was before, that somewhere, just beyond the edges of this room, presence is beginning to accumulate, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet persistence that defines everything here. The desk remains as it is. The lamp burns without change. The ink continues to flow in measured lines that do not deviate from their path. But the stillness has shifted. It no longer belongs entirely to the room. It stretches outward now, connecting what is inside with what waits beyond. The separation begins to thin, not through action, but through proximity. The work does not stop. It cannot, not yet. The process continues because it has always continued, because it exists independently of what gathers outside. But something within that process begins to take on a different weight, not because the actions themselves have changed, but because they are no longer contained within their original boundaries. They extend outward now, touching something unseen, something that has not yet fully entered but cannot be kept out indefinitely. The night holds both conditions at once. Inside, the quiet repetition of ink and paper, steady and controlled. Outside, the slow formation of presence, undefined but persistent. neither interrupts the other. Not yet. For now, they exist side by side, separated only by walls that do not fully conceal what is beginning to take shape. The desk and the system. Morning arrives without ceremony, carried in not by light but by the gradual softening of shadow. The lamp on the desk remains lit, its presence unchanged even as the darkness beyond the curtains begins to thin. What enters the room is not brightness, but a muted grey that settles quietly along the edges of objects, revealing them without altering their form. The desk stands as it did before, its surface ordered, its contents aligned with the same careful precision. Nothing suggests interruption. Nothing suggests that the night has ended. The work continues as though it never paused. A document rests beneath the hand, its surface smooth and unmarked except for the lines that define its structure. The hand moves with the same measured consistency, guiding ink across the page in strokes that do not vary. Each motion follows the last with quiet certainty, neither hurried nor delayed. There is no hesitation in the process. The act has been performed too many times to allow for uncertainty. It exists now as a sequence rather than a decision. Around the desk, the room begins to reveal its details more clearly. The walls hold a pale tone, interrupted only by the outlines of frames and shelves that carry no decoration beyond function. A chair stands slightly offset from the desk, its position unchanged, its purpose implied rather than used. The air carries no scent beyond the faint trace of ink and paper, a combination so familiar it has become indistinct. Nothing in the room calls attention to itself. Everything exists in support of what occurs at the desk. The sound of the city returns slowly, though it remains distant. A cart passes somewhere along the street, its wheels moving over uneven ground with a dull, intermittent rhythm. Voices follow, low and indistinct, not rising above the level of ordinary conversation. They do not gather or linger. They move through the space beyond the walls and then fade, leaving the room unchanged. The outside world resumes its motion, but it does so without urgency, without drawing attention inward. On the desk, the papers form a quiet sequence. One is completed and placed to the side. Another takes its place without delay. The transition is seamless, as though the space between documents does not exist. Each page carries the same structure, the same expectation of completion. There is no variation in their purpose, only in the names and details that fill their lines. These differences do not alter the process. They pass through it, one after another, absorbed into the same pattern of movement. A telegram rests among the documents, its presence distinct only in its form. It remains unopened, positioned slightly apart from the others, as though awaiting a moment that has not yet arrived. Its edges are crisp, its surface untouched, and because of this, it carries a quiet sense of interruption that has not yet taken place. It does not disturb the work. Not yet. It exists as a possibility, contained within the same order that governs everything else in the room. The hand does not reach for it. The process continues uninterrupted, guided by the same internal rhythm that has defined every movement so far. Ink meets paper again, forming lines that align with those that came before. There is no change in pressure, no shift in pace. The work does not adapt to the presence of the telegram. It continues as though nothing has entered that could alter its course. Beyond the desk, time moves in ways that are not immediately visible. The grey light strengthens slightly, though it remains subdued, never fully replacing the lamp that continues to define the space. The boundaries of the room become clearer, yet they do not expand. They hold firm, containing the process within a structure that does not invite deviation. Everything remains where it should be. Everything functions as expected. And within this stability, the system reveals itself, not through declaration, but through repetition. A document arrives. It is processed. It is completed. It is set aside. Another follows. There is no question of whether this sequence will continue. It has already demonstrated that it will. The system does not require affirmation. It exists in the certainty of its own continuation, in the quiet understanding that each step leads naturally to the next without the need for reflection. It is not rigid in appearance, but in function. It allows for movement only within the boundaries it defines. The telegram remains unopened. Its presence does not yet belong to the sequence. But it has entered the room, and because it has entered, it will, at some point, be acknowledged, not as a disruption, but as something that must be processed, just like everything else. The room continues to hold its balance as the morning settles more firmly into place, though the change remains subtle enough that it could be missed if not observed over time. The grey light at the edges deepens slightly, giving form to surfaces that had previously remained indistinct, but it does not replace the lamp. The lamp remains the center of clarity, its steady glow maintaining a controlled space within which the work unfolds. Outside, the city has begun its day, but here, the transition from night to morning does not alter the rhythm. The process continues as it did before, uninterrupted by the passage of hours. The papers on the desk move in a sequence that does not require variation. Each document arrives with its own details, but these details pass through the same structure, the same expectations, the same quiet handling that defines the system. A name is read. A place is noted. A line is completed. The ink follows the same path across each page, guided by a hand that no longer pauses to consider the meaning of what it records. The act itself has become the focus, not the content. The system functions because the process is allowed to remain unchanged. You watch the movement without needing to follow each detail. The repetition creates its own kind of understanding, one that does not depend on individual entries, but on the consistency between them. It becomes clear that the value of the work lies not in what is written, but in the fact that it is written at all. The completion of each document affirms the system's ability to continue. It does not require interpretation. It requires only continuation. The unopened telegram remains at the edge of the desk, its presence now more noticeable not because it has changed, but because everything around it has remained so consistent. In a space defined by movement, stillness begins to stand out. It does not interrupt the sequence, but it introduces a quiet question into a process that otherwise does not ask any. Why it has not been opened is not immediately clear. It does not appear urgent. It does not demand attention. And yet, it exists outside the rhythm, waiting without participating. The hand continues its work, moving from one document to the next without deviation. The pages are aligned, the ink applied, the completed forms set aside with the same measured care. There is no visible fatigue, no sign that the repetition has begun to weigh on the process. It continues with the same quiet precision, sustained by a structure that does not require adjustment. The system holds because nothing within it has yet required it to change. Outside, the sounds of the city begin to layer more noticeably. Footsteps pass with greater frequency, voices overlap briefly before separating again, and the distant movement of vehicles becomes more constant. These sounds remain contained beyond the walls, filtered into a background that does not disturb the room. They serve only as a reminder that the world beyond continues to move in its own patterns, separate from the one unfolding here. The room does not respond. It does not need to. Time advances, though it leaves no clear mark within the space. The lamp still burns. The desk remains ordered. The sequence of documents continues without interruption. It becomes difficult to distinguish one moment from the next, not because they are identical, but because they belong to the same continuous flow. There is no beginning to return to, no end to anticipate, only the steady unfolding of process. The telegram waits. It has not shifted position. Its edges remain sharp, its surface untouched. But its presence has begun to alter the space in a way that cannot be measured through action. It introduces a quiet imbalance, not in the arrangement of objects, but in the continuity of the system. Everything else moves. Everything else participates. It does not. And because it does not, it begins to draw attention, not through urgency, but through difference. The hand pauses for the first time, though only briefly, and not in a way that disrupts the rhythm entirely. The motion slows, the next document not immediately drawn into place. The pause is small, almost indistinguishable from the movements that came before it, but it exists, and in that moment, the space between actions becomes visible. You notice it not as a break, but as a shift. The hand moves again, completing the document beneath it, placing it aside with the same care as all the others. The process resumes, but something within it has changed, however slightly. The system has not broken. It has not even bent. But it has registered the presence of something that does not fully belong. The telegram remains unopened. The room continues. The sequence holds. But the stillness at the edge of the desk has begun to take on a different weight. Not yet a disruption. Not yet a decision. Only the quiet awareness that something within this controlled and continuous system has entered without becoming part of it. And sooner or later, it will have to be addressed. The edges of waiting. Outside, the morning has fully taken hold, though it does not arrive with clarity or warmth. The light remains subdued, filtered through a sky that holds its color close, offering no sharp contrast, no clear division between one hour and the next. The street in front of the building begins to define itself not through movement, but through presence. Shapes gather slowly, forming along the edges where walls meet pavement, where doorways open just enough to allow space for those who remain near them. At first, it is difficult to distinguish whether these figures are arriving or simply not leaving. They stand without urgency. Their posture carries no clear intention beyond remaining where they are. A man adjusts the collar of his coat, not to protect against the cold, but as a gesture that fills time. A woman shifts her weight from one foot to the other, her gaze fixed not on the building itself, but somewhere just below it, as though the act of looking directly would require something she is not yet prepared to offer. Others stand in similar stillness, their movements small, contained within the space they occupy. No one speaks loudly. No one calls out. The air holds their presence without allowing it to rise into sound. You observe the way the space begins to change around them, though nothing has been formally altered. The street remains as it was. The walls do not move. The doorway stands open only as much as it always has. And yet, the presence of those who wait begins to redefine the boundaries of the place. What was once a passage becomes a point of return. What was once open becomes occupied. The space takes on a different meaning, not through action, but through the quiet decision of many to remain within it. Time moves differently here. It does not advance through events or transitions, but through endurance. The figures do not mark its passing with clear changes in position or activity. Instead, they remain, and in remaining, they allow time to settle into them. The longer they stand, the less distinguishable the beginning of their waiting becomes. It stretches backward, dissolving into a point that can no longer be clearly remembered. It also stretches forward, though without promise of resolution. It exists as a continuous present, held in place by the absence of movement. A few more arrive, though their arrival is not announced. They step into the space quietly, finding positions that do not disrupt those already there. The line does not form in a straight path. It gathers unevenly, shaped by the limitations of the street and the willingness of those within it to adjust. There is no instruction guiding them, no visible authority organizing their presence. And yet, an order begins to emerge, not imposed, but understood. Those who have been there longer remain closer to the doorway. Those who arrive later find their place behind or beside them, aligning themselves without needing to be told. The building itself does not respond. Its windows reflect the muted light without revealing what lies within. The doorway remains unchanged, neither opening further nor closing. It exists as a boundary, one that can be crossed but not easily approached. Those who wait do not press against it. They maintain a distance that suggests both respect and uncertainty. To move too close would require an action that the moment does not yet support. To remain where they are allows the condition of waiting to continue without interruption. Inside, the work continues as it has. The desk remains the center of motion, the papers moving through their sequence without awareness of what gathers beyond the walls. The telegram still rests at the edge, its presence unchanged, though its significance has begun to shift in ways that are not yet visible in action. The hand moves across another page, completing it with the same quiet precision, placing it aside, reaching for the next. Outside, the waiting deepens. The figures no longer appear as separate individuals, though they remain distinct in form. Their presence begins to merge into something collective, something defined less by who they are and more by the fact that they are there together. Their stillness aligns. Their small movements echo one another. A glance downward, a shift of weight, the adjustment of a sleeve. These actions repeat across the group, creating a pattern that mirrors the repetition inside the room, though shaped by different conditions. There is no signal that anything will change, no indication that the waiting will end. And yet, it continues, sustained not by expectation, but by necessity. To leave would be to abandon something that cannot easily be replaced. To remain is to hold on to the possibility, however undefined, that the doorway may, at some point, open in a way that allows passage. You begin to sense the quiet connection between the two spaces. Inside, the repetition of process. Outside, the repetition of waiting. Neither acknowledges the other directly, but both continue side by side, held within the same morning that moves forward without revealing what it will bring. The morning settles into a steadier form, though it never fully clarifies. The light remains diffused, pressing gently against the surfaces of the street without revealing their full shape. The figures gathered near the building do not disperse as the hours begin to accumulate. Instead, they adjust in ways that preserve their presence. A step forward creates space behind. A shift to the side allows another to remain within reach of the doorway. These movements are small, nearly imperceptible, yet they carry a quiet coordination that emerges without instruction. The line, if it can be called that, does not follow a single direction. It bends slightly along the wall, extending outward in a way that resists measurement. There is no clear beginning, no defined end, only a gradual thinning at its outer edges, where new arrivals hesitate before committing themselves fully to the space. Some stand just beyond the main group, observing without stepping in, as though testing the weight of the decision to remain. Others move closer, drawn not by certainty, but by the shared understanding that proximity might matter, even if its meaning is not yet clear. You notice how the waiting begins to shape behavior in subtle ways. Conversations, when they occur, are brief and contained, spoken in low tones that do not carry beyond a few steps. They do not build into dialogue. They fade quickly, returning the space to its underlying quiet. Most remain silent, not out of discipline, but because there is little that can be said that would alter the condition. Words would not move the line. They would not open the door. And so they are used sparingly, if at all. A man near the front reaches into his coat and removes a folded document, holding it for a moment before returning it to its place. The action is deliberate, though it leads to no immediate result. Others perform similar gestures, checking what they carry, adjusting what they hold, as if to confirm that something remains within their control. These movements repeat across the group, not in unison, but with enough similarity that they begin to form a pattern. The waiting does not erase individuality, but it aligns it, drawing each person into the same quiet rhythm. The doorway remains unchanged. It neither invites nor refuses. It exists as a fixed point, its meaning defined entirely by those who stand before it. Occasionally, it opens slightly, allowing a figure to pass through or emerge, but these moments are brief and do not alter the overall condition. Each opening is followed by a return to stillness, as though the act of movement must be contained quickly to preserve the balance of the space. Those who remain outside do not press forward when the door opens. They hold their positions, allowing the moment to pass without disruption. Inside, the room continues its own sequence. The desk holds its order. The papers move as they have before. The hand writes, completes, sets aside, and begins again. The telegram remains at the edge, its presence now carrying a quiet persistence that mirrors the waiting outside. It has not been forgotten. It has not been ignored. It exists within the awareness of the space, though it has not yet been brought into motion. Time advances without clear markers, but its presence can be felt in the way the waiting begins to settle deeper into the bodies of those who remain. Shoulders lower slightly. Movements become more economical. The initial alertness that accompanies arrival gives way to a more sustained form of endurance. The waiting is no longer new. It has become the condition itself, something that does not require constant attention because it is now constant. You begin to understand that the line is not defined by distance, but by duration. Those closer to the doorway have not simply arrived earlier, they have remained longer. Their position is the result of time held in place, not movement forward. This realization shifts the meaning of the space. Progress is not measured in steps, but in the ability to continue waiting without leaving. The city moves around them, though it does not fully intersect with their presence. Passers-by glance briefly, then continue on, their attention drawn elsewhere. The street accommodates both conditions, the movement of those passing through and the stillness of those who remain, without forcing either to change. The two exist alongside one another, separate yet connected by the same physical space. Inside, the hand pauses again, though only for a moment. The next document is not immediately drawn into place. The space between actions becomes visible once more, just as it did before. The pause is subtle, but it carries a different weight now, as though it is not only the presence of the telegram that creates it, but something beyond the walls that has begun to register within the rhythm of the room. The hand moves again, completing the document, setting it aside. The process resumes. But the connection has formed, however quietly. Outside, the waiting continues, deepening not through change, but through persistence. Inside, the system holds, though it has begun to sense what exists beyond its boundaries. Neither yields, neither fully acknowledges the other, and yet both have begun to shape the same moment, held between them in a balance that cannot remain unchanged forever. The weight of paper. The room holds a steadier light now, though it remains restrained, never fully separating 1 hour from the next. The lamp continues to define the center of the space, its glow unchanged, even as the day presses gently against the curtains. Shadows have softened along the edges of the desk, revealing the subtle variations in the surface, small marks left by use, faint impressions where paper has rested and been moved again and again. Nothing here is new. Everything carries the quiet accumulation of repetition. The papers form their familiar sequence, yet their presence begins to take on a different weight, not in their appearance, but in the way they are handled. Each document is lifted with the same measured care, aligned beneath the hand, and completed with the same steady motion. But the consistency itself begins to reveal something that was not immediately visible before. The uniformity does not erase difference. It conceals it. Beneath the identical structure of each page, the details vary in ways that are not immediately expressed through the act of writing. A name appears. It is recorded without hesitation. Another follows. Then another. The ink does not slow to consider them. It does not linger. It passes over each line with the same controlled pressure, forming letters that hold their shape regardless of what they represent. The system does not respond to difference. It absorbs it, processes it, and moves on. In this way, the papers remain equal in form, even as they carry different meanings. You observe the way the documents accumulate, not just in number, but in presence. The completed pages no longer sit as isolated results. They begin to gather into something larger, something that extends beyond the immediate task. Their alignment on the desk suggests order, but their quantity begins to suggest something else. A quiet expansion, a sense that the work is not merely continuing, but increasing in a way that cannot be measured through a single moment. The telegram remains at the edge, its stillness now contrasted more sharply by the movement around it. It has not shifted position, but it no longer appears separate in the same way. Its presence has begun to merge with the growing weight of the papers, as though it belongs to the same condition, even if it has not yet entered the sequence. It carries the same quiet authority as the documents being processed, though its content remains unseen. The hand continues its motion, though the space between actions has begun to change. The pause before reaching for the next document is slightly longer now, though still brief enough to pass without notice if not observed closely. The movement itself remains controlled, but it no longer feels entirely detached from what is being written. There is a subtle shift, not in the action, but in the awareness that accompanies it. Outside, the waiting continues to deepen. The line has extended further along the wall, its edges now reaching into parts of the street that were previously untouched. The figures remain in place, their positions adjusted only as necessary to accommodate those who have arrived since the morning began. The stillness holds, but it has taken on a density that was not present before. It is no longer defined solely by the absence of movement. It is defined by the presence of many who have chosen, or been compelled, to remain. The connection between the two spaces becomes more apparent, though it is not yet direct. Inside, the papers accumulate. Outside, the people do the same. Both are held within systems that do not easily respond to change. Both are sustained through repetition, and both begin to exert a quiet pressure that is not immediately visible in action, but can be felt in the way the conditions continue to build. A document is completed and set aside. Another is drawn into place. The sequence holds, but its continuity begins to reveal its limits. The more it continues, the more it suggests that it cannot remain unchanged indefinitely. The system functions because it does not question itself. But as the papers accumulate, and as the presence outside grows, the absence of questioning begins to take on a different meaning. The telegram waits. It remains unopened, but it no longer feels separate from the process. It exists within it now, not as a participant, but as something that will eventually require acknowledgement. Its presence has become part of the weight that fills the room, a quiet addition that does not yet alter the sequence, but cannot remain outside it forever. The hand pauses once more. This time, the pause is not defined by hesitation, but by recognition. The next document is not immediately reached for. The space between actions expands, just enough to be felt. Not yet a decision. Not yet a change. Only the quiet sense that the weight of what is being handled has begun to exceed the simplicity of the process that contains it. The pause settles into the room without altering its structure, yet it lingers longer than before, stretching just enough to give shape to something that had previously passed unnoticed. The hand remains still above the desk, not withdrawn, not committed to motion, but suspended within the space between actions. The lamp continues to cast its steady light, and in that constancy, the stillness becomes more visible. It is not an interruption. It is a moment that has always existed, now extended just enough to be recognized. The next document lies within reach, its edges aligned with the others, its form indistinguishable from the pages that came before it. It carries the same structure, the same expectation of completion, and yet it is not immediately drawn into place. The sequence, though unbroken, has slowed. The difference is subtle, but it changes the way the process is held. The movement that follows is deliberate, not because it requires effort, but because it no longer passes without awareness. The document is lifted, positioned, and examined, though the examination does not alter what must be done. The lines are read in the same order as always. The spaces are filled with the same measured precision. Ink meets paper, forming letters that maintain their consistency, their clarity, their quiet authority. The act remains unchanged in its form, but beneath that form something has begun to shift, not in what is written, but in the recognition that what is written carries weight beyond the page. You observe how the completed documents now rest differently on the desk. Their alignment remains exact, their placement unchanged, but their accumulation has reached a point where they no longer appear as separate results. They form a presence of their own, a quiet extension of the process that produced them. Each page contributes to this presence, adding to a structure that exists alongside the one defined by the desk and the room. It is not visible in a single moment. It is revealed only through continuation. The telegram remains where it has always been, but its stillness has taken on a new quality. It no longer appears as an isolated object waiting to be opened. It exists now as part of the same condition that defines the papers, though it has not yet been brought into motion. Its unopened state contrasts with the completed pages, creating a quiet tension within the arrangement. Everything else has been processed. It has not. Outside, the waiting continues to deepen in a way that does not rely on visible change. The figures remain in place, their positions adjusted only when necessary, their movements reduced to those required to sustain themselves within the space. The line has extended further still, though its edges remain indistinct, blending into the street in a way that resists clear definition. It is no longer possible to see it as a beginning and an end. It exists as a condition, one that has settled into the environment without needing to be acknowledged. A shift passes through the group, not as a coordinated movement, but as a subtle change in posture. Shoulders lower slightly. Heads tilt forward. The waiting has moved beyond anticipation. It has become endurance. The difference is not marked by a moment, but by a gradual adjustment that has taken place over time. The figures no longer hold themselves in readiness for immediate change. They hold themselves in a way that allows them to remain, regardless of when or whether that change will come. Inside, the hand continues its work, though the rhythm has altered in a way that is not immediately measurable. The sequence remains intact. Documents are completed. Pages are set aside. But the continuity now carries an awareness that was not present before. Each action follows the last, but it no longer does so without recognition of the accumulation that surrounds it. The space between actions continues to exist, appearing briefly, then closing again as the process resumes. These moments do not disrupt the system. They exist within it, subtle variations that do not yet alter its function. And yet, they introduce the possibility that the process is not entirely fixed, that it can, under certain conditions, adjust in ways that are not immediately visible in outcome, but are present in the experience of continuation. The telegram waits. Its presence has now become inseparable from the room. It is no longer an external element. It belongs to the same space, the same accumulation, the same quiet tension that defines the desk and the papers. It does not demand attention. It does not interrupt. But it holds a place within the system that cannot remain unaddressed indefinitely. The hand pauses once more, and this time the pause extends just enough to alter the sequence in a way that cannot be entirely absorbed. The next document is not immediately taken. The motion does not resume at once. The space holds. You sense the shift not as a break, but as a threshold. The process remains. The system holds. But the weight has reached a point where continuation alone no longer feels unchanged. Not yet a decision. Not yet a departure. Only the quiet recognition that the act of continuing has begun to carry something more than it did before. The telegram. The room remains steady, yet the stillness within it has begun to take on a different shape, as though the balance that once held everything in quiet alignment has shifted, not visibly, but in the way each element relates to the others. The lamp continues to cast its familiar light, but the space it defines now feels narrower, more contained, as if the edges of the room have drawn slightly closer without moving at all. The desk remains at the center, its surface unchanged in arrangement, yet altered in weight. The papers, once part of a seamless sequence, now rest with a presence that cannot be fully absorbed into the rhythm of the work. The telegram lies where it has always been, but it no longer exists at the edge of awareness. Its stillness has become central, not because it demands attention, but because everything around it has begun to acknowledge its presence without direct action. The hand, having paused once more, does not return immediately to the next document. Instead, it remains suspended above the desk, the space between movement and stillness held just long enough to allow the unopened message to take on a form that is no longer neutral. You observe the way the room accommodates this change without altering its structure. Nothing has moved. Nothing has been displaced. And yet, the relationship between objects has shifted. The papers no longer define the center of the process. The telegram does. Its presence introduces a different kind of order, one that is not based on repetition, but on interruption that has not yet occurred. Outside, the waiting continues, but it has settled into a deeper quiet, one that does not rely on stillness alone. The figures remain where they are, their positions held not by expectation, but by a kind of acceptance that has formed over time. The line no longer feels like a temporary arrangement. It has become part of the street, as fixed in its presence as the walls it leans against. The doorway remains unchanged, its boundary intact, its meaning held entirely within the possibility it represents. Inside, the hand lowers slowly, not toward the next document, but toward the telegram. The motion is not abrupt. It carries the same measured control as every action that has come before it. There is no visible urgency, no indication that this movement differs from the others in form. And yet, it does not belong to the same sequence. It exists outside the pattern that has defined the room until now. The fingers rest lightly on the surface of the telegram, feeling its edges, its firmness, its place among the other objects on the desk. For a moment, the motion stops again, not in hesitation, but in recognition. The unopened state of the document is no longer sustained by omission. It has been reached. It has been touched. It now exists within the process, not as something separate, but as something that must be acknowledged. The envelope is lifted. The sound is soft, barely audible, but distinct enough to mark the shift from one condition to another. The papers beneath it remain in place, their order undisturbed, yet the act of lifting introduces a space where there was none before. The sequence of documents has been interrupted, not by force, but by the quiet inclusion of something that does not follow its rules. The telegram is held for a moment, its weight slight, its presence disproportionate to its form. The hand turns it gently, aligning it within the field of light cast by the lamp. The surface reflects the glow faintly, revealing nothing of what lies within. It remains closed, its contents contained, its meaning not yet revealed. The room holds its breath, though nothing in it moves to indicate such a pause. You sense the shift not through action, but through the absence of continuation. The sequence has stopped. Not entirely, but enough. Outside, the waiting persists, unchanged in form, yet now connected to something within the room that has begun to move beyond its previous boundaries. Inside, the telegram rests in the hand, not yet opened, but no longer part of the stillness that once allowed it to remain unseen. The envelope remains unopened for a moment longer, held within the steady field of light that has not changed, though everything around it has. The hand does not rush the motion that must follow. It rests, feeling the slight resistance of the paper, the firmness of what is sealed within. There is no visible indication of what the message contains, and yet the weight it carries is no longer neutral. It has already altered the room simply by being held. The edge of the envelope is turned slightly, aligned with the direction of the light. The fingers move with the same careful precision that has defined every action at the desk, but the rhythm is no longer continuous. Each movement is distinct now, separated by small intervals that give shape to the act itself. The opening does not occur as part of a sequence. It unfolds as its own condition. The seal gives way with a quiet sound, soft enough to blend into the stillness, yet clear enough to mark the moment when containment ends. The envelope opens without resistance beyond that initial break, revealing the folded paper within. It is drawn out slowly, not because it is difficult, but because the motion no longer belongs to the automatic flow that guided the work before. It requires attention. It holds it. The paper is unfolded in measured steps, each crease released in turn, until the surface lies open beneath the light. The lines of text become visible, though they are not yet read aloud or even fully taken in. They exist first as form, rows of letters arranged with the same precision as the documents that have been processed throughout the morning. And yet, they are different. They do not belong to the same system of repetition. They carry instruction, not request. They move in one direction, without expectation of return. The hand remains still for a moment, allowing the presence of the text to settle into the space. The room does not respond outwardly. The desk remains as it is. The papers are undisturbed. The lamp continues to cast its steady light. But the balance has shifted. What was once defined by continuation is now defined by interruption that cannot be absorbed into the existing rhythm. You observe the way the reading begins, not as a rapid movement across the page, but as a slow, deliberate passage from one line to the next. The eyes follow the text without deviation, taking in each word with the same care that has been applied to every written line before it. But the act of reading does not mirror the act of writing. It does not produce. It receives. and what it receives does not pass through the system unchanged. Outside, the waiting continues, though it has deepened into a stillness that no longer anticipates immediate movement. The figures remain, their presence now settled into the street as though it belongs there. The line holds its shape, not through force, but through endurance. The doorway remains closed, its meaning unchanged, though the condition around it has grown more defined. Inside, the reading continues. The lines of the telegram unfold in sequence, each one adding to a structure that does not require repetition to assert its authority. The message does not need to be reinforced through multiple forms. It exists in a single instance, complete in its instruction. The clarity of it stands in contrast to the accumulation of documents that surround it, where meaning is built through quantity. Here, meaning is immediate. The hand lowers slightly as the final line is reached, the paper remaining open, its surface fully revealed. There is no visible reaction, no movement that would indicate a break from the composure that has defined the room. And yet, the presence of the message has already begun to alter the conditions within which the work exists. The papers on the desk do not change. They remain aligned, their sequence intact. But their relationship to the process has shifted. They no longer exist in isolation from external direction. They now exist within a structure that includes instruction, limitation, and expectation that extends beyond the room. The telegram is not set aside immediately. It remains open, held within the same space as the documents that continue to define the work. Its presence does not erase what has come before it. It redefines it. The hand moves, not to resume the previous sequence, but to place the telegram gently upon the desk, among the papers it does not resemble. It rests there, not as part of the process, but as something that now stands alongside it, impossible to ignore, impossible to fully integrate without change. The room holds. The system remains. But it no longer exists in the same condition. You sense the shift not as a decision, but as a new boundary. What was once continuous has encountered something that does not yield to repetition. Outside, the waiting persists. Inside, the instruction has arrived. And between them, the space that once held only process has begun to narrow. The first deviation. The room does not change in form, but the space within it has begun to settle into a different arrangement, one that cannot be seen in the placement of objects, yet is felt in the way each movement now relates to what has already been introduced. The telegram rests open on the desk, its presence no longer separate, no longer waiting. It has entered the system, though it does not belong to it. The papers remain aligned, their sequence intact, yet the order they represent has been altered in a way that does not require visible disruption. The hand returns to the documents, but the motion is no longer continuous in the way it once was. The next page is lifted, positioned, and read, yet the act carries a different weight, one that does not interrupt the process, but accompanies it. The lines are filled as before, the ink applied with the same measured precision. The form remains unchanged. The structure holds. But beneath it, the awareness of the instruction now exists alongside the action, creating a quiet tension that does not resolve itself through repetition. You observe the way the writing continues, how each letter forms with the same clarity, how each document is completed and set aside with the same care. The system does not reject the telegram. It does not resist it. It continues, as it always has, because continuation is what defines it. And yet, the act of continuing has begun to carry a second condition, one that does not align with the first. The space between actions becomes more visible now. The pause before reaching for the next document extends slightly, not enough to halt the process, but enough to allow the presence of the telegram to remain active within it. The movement resumes, but it does so with a quiet knowledge that what is being done exists in relation to something that has not yet been fully absorbed. Outside, the waiting continues, though it has shifted in subtle ways that do not alter its form, but deepen its presence. The figures remain in place, their positions held through endurance rather than expectation. The line does not press forward. It does not retreat. It holds, sustained by the same quiet repetition that defines the work inside. Each person remains within their space, adjusting only as needed, their movements minimal, their attention fixed not on any visible change, but on the absence of it. The connection between the two spaces strengthens, though it remains unspoken. Inside, the documents continue to accumulate. Outside, the people do the same. Both are governed by systems that do not respond quickly. Both are sustained by repetition. And both now exist within the presence of something that has begun to alter the conditions without yet changing the visible outcome. The hand completes another document, setting it aside with the same measured care. The next page is drawn into place, but this time the motion slows slightly before the ink meets the paper. The pause is not hesitation in the traditional sense. It does not suggest uncertainty about what must be done. Instead, it reflects the presence of an alternative that has not yet been acted upon. The telegram remains open. Its lines do not change. Its instruction does not fade. It exists within the room as a constant, not requiring repetition to maintain its authority. Unlike the documents, which derive their meaning through continuation, the telegram holds its meaning in a single instance, complete and unchanging. It does not need to be reinforced. It simply remains. The hand moves again, completing the document. The system continues. But the continuity now exists alongside something that does not belong to it. You sense the shift not as a break, but as a divergence that has not yet taken form. The process remains intact. The instruction remains present. And between them, a space has opened, small but unmistakable, where continuation and deviation now exist together, without yet separating into distinct paths. The space between continuation and change does not widen all at once. It remains narrow, almost indistinguishable from the rhythm that has defined the room since the beginning. The hand moves again, lifting the next document, aligning it beneath the light, allowing the familiar structure to guide the motion. The ink follows its path across the page, forming lines that remain consistent, steady, controlled. Nothing in the action itself suggests alteration. The system continues to function exactly as it was designed to do. And yet, the difference now exists not in what is done, but in what is held alongside it. The telegram remains open on the desk, its presence no longer peripheral. It rests within the same space as the documents, but it does not blend into them. Its lines are not part of the sequence. They do not invite repetition. They do not require continuation. They exist as a fixed point, unchanging, asserting themselves without movement. The instruction does not fade as the work resumes. It remains, occupying the same mental space as each document that passes beneath the hand. You observe the way the writing continues, how each name is formed with the same clarity, how each detail is recorded without deviation from the expected structure. The act has not become uncertain. It has not become hesitant. But it no longer exists in isolation. The awareness of the instruction now moves with each line, present but not yet acted upon, shaping the space within which the process continues. Outside, the waiting has settled into a deeper stillness, one that no longer feels temporary. The figures hold their positions with a quiet endurance that does not rely on anticipation. They do not lean forward in expectation of movement. They do not shift in response to the passage of time. They remain, allowing the condition itself to define their presence. The line has become less a formation and more a state of being, sustained through the absence of change. A slight movement occurs near the doorway, though it does not disrupt the balance of the space. The door opens briefly, allowing a figure to pass through, then closes again with the same quiet finality as before. Those outside do not press forward. They do not alter their positions beyond what is necessary to maintain the line. The moment passes without consequence, absorbed into the continuity of waiting. Inside, the hand pauses again, though the pause is now part of the rhythm rather than a deviation from it. It appears between actions, subtle and contained, yet consistent enough to suggest that something within the process has begun to adjust. The next document is not immediately taken. The space holds for a moment longer than before, allowing the presence of the telegram to remain active within the sequence. The hand moves again, completing the document, setting it aside. Another follows. The system continues. But the space between actions no longer closes entirely. It remains, small but persistent, creating a condition in which continuation and deviation exist side by side. The difference is not yet visible in outcome. The documents remain consistent. The sequence remains intact. But the process now carries an internal division, one that does not interrupt its function, but alters its nature. The telegram remains unchanged. Its instruction does not adapt to the continuation of work. It does not diminish in relevance. It stands in contrast to the repetition of the documents, not by opposing them directly, but by existing outside the structure that defines them. It introduces a second framework into the room, one that does not align with the first, yet cannot be ignored. You sense the quiet tension that forms between these two conditions. The system, sustained through repetition. The instruction, sustained through singular authority. Neither yields, neither resolves. And within the space where they meet, the process begins to shift in ways that cannot yet be fully seen, but can be felt in the way each action now carries more than it did before. Outside, the waiting continues, deepening without movement. Inside, the work continues, unchanged in form. But the first deviation has already begun, not as an action, not as a break, but as a presence that exists within the act of continuing itself. The continuation of disobedience. The room returns to its rhythm, though it no longer feels as complete as it once did. The sequence resumes in full motion, the hand moving steadily from one document to the next, maintaining the same clarity, the same precision, the same controlled pace that has defined every action at the desk. The papers continue to pass through the system without interruption, each one aligned, completed, and set aside in quiet succession. Nothing in the structure has changed. Nothing in the process appears broken. And yet, the continuation now carries a different quality. The telegram remains open, its presence absorbed into the space without being integrated into the sequence. It does not interrupt the work. It does not demand acknowledgement with each movement. It simply remains, a constant within the room that does not require repetition to maintain its influence. The instruction it carries has not been acted upon directly. It has not been followed. But neither has it been dismissed. It exists alongside the work, creating a condition in which each action now unfolds in relation to something that stands outside the system's design. You observe the way the writing continues, how each document is completed with the same measured care. The ink flows without hesitation, forming lines that remain consistent, steady, unchanged in their execution. The act itself has not become uncertain. It has not slowed beyond the small pauses that have already become part of the rhythm. It continues because it has always continued. But now, continuation itself has taken on a different meaning. The documents are no longer processed in isolation from instruction. Each page that is completed now exists in quiet contrast to the message that rests open on the desk. The system continues to function, but it does so in a way that no longer aligns fully with the authority that governs it. The difference is not visible in the documents themselves. They remain identical in form, identical in structure. But the condition under which they are produced has shifted. Outside, the waiting continues, though it has deepened into something that no longer depends on expectation. The figures remain in place, their presence sustained through endurance rather than anticipation. The line has settled into the street as a fixed condition, its edges extending beyond immediate view, its structure maintained through the quiet understanding that leaving is not an option easily taken. A man near the middle of the line lowers himself slightly, resting against the wall without fully sitting. The motion is slow, careful, as though conserving energy rather than responding to fatigue. Others make similar adjustments, subtle shifts that allow them to remain without drawing attention. The waiting has begun to shape the body as much as the space, guiding movement toward stillness, toward preservation. The doorway remains unchanged. It does not open. It does not signal. It exists as it always has, a boundary that defines the separation between those who wait and whatever lies within. Inside, the hand continues its work. A document is completed. Another is drawn into place. The sequence holds. But the awareness of the telegram now moves with each action, present not as an interruption, but as a parallel condition that cannot be resolved through repetition. The system does not adapt to it. It does not absorb it. It continues alongside it, creating a state in which obedience and disobedience exist within the same motion. The act of writing, once defined solely by adherence to process, now carries an additional dimension. It continues, and in continuing, it diverges, not visibly, not decisively, but unmistakably. You sense the shift not through what changes, but through what remains the same under altered conditions. The documents still pass through the system. The ink still forms its lines. The hand still moves with steady control. And yet, each completed page now exists within a condition that no longer aligns fully with the authority that governs it. Outside, the waiting deepens. Inside, the work continues. And between them, the quiet space where instruction has been received but not followed begins to widen, not through action, but through the persistence of continuation itself. The rhythm holds, but it no longer closes around itself as completely as it once did. Each movement continues with the same outward precision, yet the space surrounding it remains slightly open, as though the sequence no longer seals itself fully between one action and the next. The hand reaches for another document, aligns it beneath the light, and begins again. Ink meets paper. Lines are formed. The structure remains intact. But the continuity now carries something that does not belong to the system that sustains it. The telegram rests within sight, its presence no longer requiring attention to assert itself. It has become part of the environment, as constant as the desk, as fixed as the lamp. It does not interrupt the process directly. It does not alter the form of what is written. But it has introduced a second condition into the room, one that exists alongside the first without merging into it. The work continues, but it does so within a space that now holds two frameworks, each complete, each unyielding. You observe the way the documents accumulate, how they continue to form a steady sequence of completion, each one aligned with the next. The growing stack no longer feels like a simple result of repetition. It has taken on the quality of continuation that resists limitation. Each page adds to the presence on the desk, extending it outward, reinforcing the process through which it was created. The system demonstrates its strength not through change, but through its ability to continue without deviation. Outside, the waiting has settled into a deeper stillness, one that no longer shifts with the passing of time. The figures remain in place, their movements reduced to what is necessary to sustain themselves within the condition. The line no longer feels temporary. It has become part of the environment, its presence as constant as the buildings that surround it. Those who stand within it no longer measure their waiting in moments. They exist within it as a state that has no clear boundary. A faint change passes through the group, not as a movement forward, but as a subtle adjustment that spreads without coordination. A figure near the front steps slightly to the side, allowing space for another to move closer to the doorway. The shift is small, almost imperceptible, yet it carries a quiet understanding. The line does not advance, but it reorganizes itself, preserving its form while accommodating the presence within it. The waiting adapts without changing its nature. Inside, the hand continues its motion, though the pauses between actions now appear with greater consistency. They do not interrupt the process. They exist within it, small intervals that do not alter the outcome, yet change the experience of continuation. The next document is not always taken immediately. The space holds for a moment, allowing the presence of the telegram to remain active within the sequence before the motion resumes. The act of writing continues. The system remains intact, but the pauses now define it as much as the movements. The telegram does not move. Its instruction does not change. It remains as a fixed point within the room, unaltered by the continuation of work. The difference between it and the documents becomes more pronounced over time. The documents require repetition to maintain their presence. The telegram requires only its existence. It does not need to be reinforced. It simply remains. You sense the tension that forms between these two conditions, not as conflict, but as coexistence that cannot be resolved through continuation alone. The system continues because it is built to do so. The instruction remains because it cannot be undone. Neither yields to the other. Neither disappears. And within this shared space, the act of continuing has begun to take on a new meaning. It is no longer simply the absence of change. It has become the presence of something that moves quietly against what has been established, not through visible action, but through persistence. Outside, the waiting holds, deep and unmoving. Inside, the work continues, steady and controlled. But the condition that now connects them has shifted. The continuation is no longer neutral. It has become deliberate, not in its form, not yet in its outcome, but in the quiet understanding that to continue, under these conditions, is no longer the same as before. The hand that does not stop. The day advances, though it does not announce itself through light or sound in any way that disrupts the steady rhythm of the room. The lamp continues to burn with the same quiet certainty, its glow unchanged even as the world beyond the curtains shifts toward afternoon. Time has ceased to mark itself through visible transitions here. It is carried instead through repetition, through the number of documents completed, through the subtle changes in posture and movement that accumulate without drawing attention. The hand continues its work. It moves from one page to the next without hesitation, maintaining the same clarity, the same controlled motion that has defined every action so far. The ink flows steadily, forming lines that do not vary in their structure or execution. Each document is completed and set aside with the same care, contributing to the growing presence on the desk. The sequence remains intact. The system holds. And yet, the continuation has deepened into something more sustained. The pauses between actions, once brief and subtle, have now become part of the rhythm itself. They do not interrupt the process. They define it. The space between documents is no longer something that closes immediately. It remains open for a moment, allowing the presence of the telegram, and everything it represents, to remain active within the act of writing. The motion resumes each time, but it does so within a condition that no longer fully belongs to the system that sustains it. You observe the way the hand moves, how it no longer appears detached from the weight of what is being written. The action remains precise, but it carries a quiet endurance that was not visible before. The repetition has extended beyond routine. It has become sustained effort, not because the movement itself has changed, but because the conditions surrounding it have. The telegram remains open on the desk. It does not move. It does not fade into the background. It exists as a constant presence, its instruction unchanged, its authority unaltered by the continuation of work. It does not require attention to assert itself. It simply remains, a fixed point within a space that continues to move around it. Outside, the waiting continues, though it has reached a depth that no longer shifts with time. The figures remain in place, their presence now fully integrated into the environment. The line has become less a formation and more a condition, one that does not advance or retreat, but holds. Those within it have adjusted to its demands, their movements reduced to what is necessary to sustain their position. The waiting no longer carries the tension of anticipation. It carries the weight of endurance. A figure near the doorway shifts slightly, stepping forward just enough to adjust the space around them. The movement is small, controlled, and does not ripple outward. Others remain where they are, their positions held through the same quiet persistence that defines the line as a whole. The doorway remains unchanged, its boundary intact, its meaning held within the possibility it represents. Inside, the hand does not stop. Another document is completed. Another is drawn into place. The sequence continues. But the act of continuing has now extended beyond simple repetition. It has become sustained in a way that does not depend on variation. The movement remains the same. The outcome remains the same. But the duration has changed. The hand continues not because the system demands it alone, but because something within the continuation itself has taken hold, carrying the process forward even as the conditions surrounding it have shifted. You sense the quiet persistence of this motion, how it resists interruption not through force, but through its own consistency. The hand does not hesitate long enough to break the sequence. It does not pause in a way that would allow the process to stop. It continues again and again, each action following the last, sustained through a rhythm that now exists within a different condition. The telegram remains. The instruction remains. The system continues. And the hand, moving between them, does not stop. The motion continues, steady and uninterrupted in form, yet altered in the way it is carried. The hand moves across the page with the same controlled precision, completing one document and drawing the next into place without visible strain. The ink flows evenly, forming lines that remain consistent in shape and spacing, each letter placed with quiet certainty. The process does not falter. It does not deviate in appearance. And yet, the duration of the movement has begun to reveal something that repetition alone cannot conceal. Time has settled into the act itself. It no longer passes outside the work. It is contained within it, measured not in hours, but in the number of pages completed, in the subtle changes in posture that accumulate without drawing attention. The hand continues, but it does so within a body that has begun to adjust to the demands of sustained repetition. The movements remain precise, yet they carry a slight heaviness now, one that does not interrupt the action, but accompanies it. You observe the way the fingers shift slightly between documents, how the grip adjusts, how the wrist lowers momentarily before rising again to continue the motion. These changes are small, almost imperceptible, yet they mark the presence of endurance. The act is no longer supported solely by routine. It is sustained through effort that does not announce itself, but persists quietly beneath the surface. The telegram remains open, its presence unchanged, its lines fixed within the same field of light that has not altered since it was first read. It does not move. It does not require attention. It exists as a constant, unyielding in its instruction, unaffected by the continuation of work that unfolds beside it. The difference between it and the documents has become more pronounced over time. The documents require repetition to maintain their presence. The telegram does not. It remains complete, its meaning fully contained within itself. Outside, the waiting holds, deeper now than before, settled into a stillness that no longer shifts with expectation. The figures remain in place, their movements reduced to what is necessary to remain standing, to maintain their position within the line. The street has absorbed their presence fully, accommodating the stillness without disruption. Those who pass by no longer pause to observe. The line has become part of the environment, its presence no longer requiring acknowledgement. A slight movement occurs near the middle of the line, where a figure adjusts their stance, stepping forward just enough to align with the space ahead. The motion does not create a ripple. It is absorbed immediately, the line maintaining its form without visible change. The waiting continues, sustained through the same quiet persistence that has defined it from the beginning. Inside, the hand continues. Another document is completed. Another is drawn into place. The sequence holds. But the continuation now carries the weight of duration. The pauses between actions remain, small but consistent, allowing the presence of the telegram to remain active within the process. These moments do not stop the work. They do not alter its outcome, but they prevent the sequence from closing completely, leaving space within it where the instruction continues to exist without being resolved. You sense the quiet strain that has begun to settle into the movement, not as fatigue that disrupts, but as endurance that sustains. The hand does not stop. It does not slow beyond what is necessary to continue. It moves forward again and again, each action following the last, carried not only by routine, but by something that now exists alongside it. The system continues. The instruction remains. And the hand, moving between them, carries both. Outside, the waiting persists, unmoving. Inside, the work persists, unbroken. And within the space where these conditions meet, the act of continuing has taken on a depth that no longer belongs solely to the system that created it. It belongs now to something sustained, something held, something that does not stop. The narrowing window. The day has moved beyond its early hours, though the change is not marked by light so much as by the way the air seems to settle, growing denser, more contained. The room holds this shift without altering its form. The lamp continues to burn with the same steady glow, but the grey light beyond the curtains has deepened, pressing closer against the boundaries of the space. It no longer feels distant. It has drawn nearer, not through movement, but through duration. The desk remains at the center. The papers continue to pass through their sequence. The hand continues its motion. And yet, something within the room has begun to close. The telegram rests open, unchanged, but its presence now carries a sharper edge, not in its form, but in the way it defines the space around it. What was once a parallel condition, existing alongside the process without altering it, has begun to press more directly against the continuation of the work. The instruction does not grow louder. It does not repeat itself. But its stillness has become more pronounced, more difficult to move around without acknowledgement. You observe the way the writing continues, how each document is completed with the same precision, how the ink flows without hesitation. The process remains intact. The system has not broken. But the continuation now feels contained within something that is no longer open-ended. The repetition, once expansive, has begun to reveal its limits. Outside, the waiting holds, but it has taken on a different quality, one that is not immediately visible in movement, but can be felt in the way the line no longer expands. The figures remain in place, their positions sustained through endurance, but the edges of the gathering have begun to stabilize. New arrivals do not extend the line as they once did. They settle into the spaces that already exist, filling gaps rather than creating new ones. The presence has reached a kind of fullness, a point beyond which it cannot easily grow. The doorway remains unchanged. It does not open. It does not signal. But the space around it has begun to tighten, not through physical movement, but through the accumulation that has already taken place. The distance between those who wait and the entrance has not shortened, yet it feels more defined, more fixed, as though the possibility of movement has narrowed without visibly closing. Inside, the hand continues its work. Another document is completed. Another is drawn into place. The sequence holds. But the pauses between actions have lengthened slightly, just enough to alter the rhythm in a way that cannot be absorbed entirely. The space between documents remains open longer, allowing the presence of the telegram to press more directly against the continuation of the process. The act of writing continues, but it no longer feels as though it can continue indefinitely. The system remains functional, but the conditions surrounding it have begun to define its limits. The telegram does not change. Its instruction remains fixed, unyielding, existing within a space that no longer expands to accommodate it. It does not need to assert itself more strongly. The environment has begun to shift around it, narrowing the space within which the work can continue without direct response. You sense the quiet constriction, not as a sudden closure, but as a gradual tightening that has been forming over time. The repetition, once open and continuous, now moves within boundaries that have become more apparent with each completed page. Outside, the waiting holds, full and unmoving. Inside, the work continues, steady but contained. And between them, the space that once allowed both conditions to exist without conflict has begun to narrow, not through action, but through the simple fact that both have continued long enough to reach their limits. The system responds. The room does not resist what has begun to form. It receives it in the same way it has received everything else, quietly, without outward adjustment, allowing the change to settle into its structure rather than forcing it into motion. The desk remains ordered. The papers continue to move in sequence. The lamp holds its steady light. And yet, the space has shifted again, not in its arrangement, but in the way it now feels occupied by something that does not originate within it. The telegram lies open, unchanged in form, but no longer alone in carrying instruction. What it introduced as a singular presence has begun to extend beyond itself, not through repetition, but through confirmation that does not need to be spoken aloud. The system, which once functioned as a closed structure, has begun to reveal its connection to something larger, something that does not rely on the rhythm of the room to assert its authority. You observe the way the hand continues its work, how each document is completed with the same precision, how the sequence remains intact. The process does not break. It does not collapse under the weight of what has been introduced. It continues, because continuation is what defines it. But the conditions under which it continues have begun to change in ways that cannot be contained within the room itself. A subtle shift occurs at the edge of the desk. It is not a movement of objects, but of presence. A second document arrives, placed among the others with the same quiet formality that has defined every addition to the desk. It does not announce itself. It does not interrupt. It simply becomes part of the environment, indistinguishable at first from the papers that have already passed through the system. And yet, its placement carries a different weight, one that does not derive from its form, but from its origin. The hand does not reach for it immediately. The sequence continues. Another document is completed. Another is set aside. The system holds. But the new presence remains, existing alongside the telegram, reinforcing what was once singular with something that now suggests continuity beyond the room. Outside, the waiting persists, but the stillness has begun to carry a faint awareness that does not manifest as movement. The figures remain in place, their positions unchanged, their endurance sustained. And yet, there is a subtle shift in the way the space feels, as though the condition of waiting has begun to respond to something not yet visible. The doorway remains closed. The line remains intact. But the air around them has taken on a different density, one that suggests the environment itself is no longer entirely static. Inside, the hand continues. The next document is drawn into place. Ink meets paper. Lines are formed. The process remains unchanged in execution. But the presence of instruction has begun to multiply, not through repetition within the room, but through the quiet understanding that what has entered once can enter again. The telegram no longer stands alone. It exists now within a condition where the system's boundaries have been crossed more than once, even if those crossings remain subtle, contained within the same quiet gestures that define everything else. You sense the shift not as an intrusion, but as an expansion of what has already begun. The system does not reject it. It does not adapt visibly. It continues. But it continues within a space that now acknowledges a connection to something beyond itself, something that does not move according to its rhythm, yet cannot be excluded from it. The hand pauses, not in hesitation, but in recognition. The next document is not immediately taken. The space holds, and within that space, the presence of instruction, no longer singular, no longer isolated, begins to define the limits of what continuation alone can sustain. The pause settles more fully into the room now, no longer a brief interval between actions, but a space that holds its own presence. The hand remains above the desk, suspended within the narrowing distance between continuation and acknowledgement. The papers lie in their familiar arrangement, the completed stack aligned with quiet precision, the unfinished documents waiting within reach. The lamp continues to cast its steady light, but the clarity it provides now reveals something that cannot be absorbed into the system it illuminates. The second document rests near the telegram. Its surface remains flat, its form consistent with the others, yet its presence carries a similar weight, one that does not derive from repetition. It does not require continuation to assert itself. It exists as a point of reference, reinforcing the condition that the telegram introduced. The instruction is no longer singular. It has begun to take shape as something that extends beyond a single message, something that cannot be contained within one instance. You observe the way the hand lowers slowly, not toward the next document in the sequence, but toward this new presence. The motion is controlled, deliberate, guided by the same precision that has defined every action at the desk. It does not break the rhythm. It redefines it. The document is lifted. The sound is soft, nearly indistinguishable from the movement of the other papers, and yet it carries a different meaning. It marks not the continuation of the system, but its contact with something that exists outside it. The paper is held within the same field of light, its lines not yet read, its content not yet revealed. For a moment it remains closed, as the telegram once did, its presence felt before its meaning is known. The unfolding begins. The motion mirrors what has already occurred, yet it does not belong to the same sequence. Each fold is released with care, each crease opened in turn, until the surface lies flat beneath the light. The lines of text become visible, arranged with the same clarity, the same precision as the telegram. They do not require interpretation to assert their authority. They exist as instruction, complete and unambiguous. The room does not change. The desk remains. The papers remain. But the condition has shifted again. The reading continues slowly, each line taken in with measured attention. The act mirrors the earlier moment, yet it carries a different weight now. This is no longer the introduction of something new. It is the confirmation of what has already begun. The instruction is not an isolated occurrence. It belongs to a structure that exists beyond the room, one that does not depend on repetition within it to maintain its presence. Outside, the waiting holds, but the stillness has begun to register this change in a way that does not require visible movement. The figures remain where they are, their endurance unchanged, their positions sustained. And yet, the air around them feels altered, as though the condition they inhabit has begun to respond to something that is not yet visible, but no longer entirely distant. Inside, the reading reaches its final line. The hand remains still for a moment, holding the document within the same space as the telegram. The two lie side by side now, their presence aligned, their instruction consistent. They do not need to be compared. They reinforce one another simply by existing together. The system remains intact. The documents that define it have not changed. The sequence can continue, but it now exists within a condition that has been clarified. Instruction has not only arrived, it has been confirmed. You sense the shift not as escalation, but as consolidation. What was once uncertain has become clear. What was once singular has become sustained. The hand lowers the document back onto the desk, placing it beside the telegram with the same care that has defined every action. The motion is quiet, controlled, contained within the same rhythm that has governed the room from the beginning. And yet, the rhythm no longer belongs entirely to the system. It now carries the presence of something that exists beyond it, something that does not move with it, but remains fixed, shaping the space within which it continues. Outside, the waiting persists, unchanged in form. Inside, the work remains possible. But the system has responded, not through alteration, not through resistance, but through recognition that it no longer exists alone. The closing of space. The room remains intact, yet it no longer feels as though it can extend itself in the way it once did. The desk still holds its order. The papers remain aligned. The lamp continues to cast its steady, unwavering light. But the space within which these elements exist has begun to contract, not through physical movement, but through the accumulation of conditions that no longer allow for indefinite continuation. The telegram lies open. The second document rests beside it. Together, they form a presence that has settled fully into the center of the room, not displacing the system, but redefining the space in which it operates. Their stillness contrasts with the movement of the papers, their fixed nature standing against the repetition that continues around them. They do not require reinforcement. They do not need to be revisited. Their meaning remains complete, contained within themselves, yet extending outward in a way that cannot be avoided. You observe the way the hand returns to the sequence, how it reaches for another document with the same measured control, how the page is aligned, how the ink begins to form its familiar lines. The action continues without visible resistance. The system holds, demonstrating its capacity to function even as the conditions around it have changed. And yet, the continuation now unfolds within a space that feels finite. The pauses between actions deepen, not in duration alone, but in presence. They no longer pass unnoticed. They hold, briefly but clearly, marking the boundaries of what can continue without response. The next document is not always taken immediately. The motion waits, as though the system itself has begun to recognize the limits of its own continuation. Outside, the waiting holds, but the stillness has taken on a more defined shape, one that no longer allows for subtle expansion or adjustment. The line remains in place, its form fixed, its presence complete. Those within it do not shift as they once did. Their movements have become minimal, reduced to what is necessary to remain. The waiting has reached a point where it can no longer deepen without change. The doorway remains closed. It does not open. It does not signal. But the space around it has begun to feel narrower, as though the possibility it represents has been compressed by the duration of waiting. The distance between those who stand outside and what lies within has not changed in measure, but it has changed in meaning. It no longer feels open. It feels defined. Inside, the hand completes another document. It is set aside with the same care as all the others. Another is drawn into place. The sequence continues. But each action now exists within a space that no longer allows for the same continuity. The telegram does not move. The second document does not change. Their presence remains constant, unyielding, shaping the environment without altering its form. They define the limits within which the system can continue, not by forcing it to stop, but by revealing that it cannot go on unchanged. You sense the quiet convergence of all that has been building, the repetition of the work, the accumulation of the papers, the presence of instruction, the endurance of waiting. All now exist within a space that has begun to close, not through sudden action, but through the simple fact that each has continued long enough to reach its boundary. The hand pauses again. This time, the pause does not feel like part of the rhythm. It feels like a point of contact. The next document remains untouched. The space holds. And within that space, the system, the instruction, and the waiting no longer exist as separate conditions. They have converged into a single moment, one that does not yet resolve, but no longer allows for continuation without consequence. The pause does not dissolve. It remains, extending just enough to define the moment in a way that the rhythm of the room can no longer absorb. The hand rests above the desk, suspended between the familiar motion of continuation and something that has not yet taken form. The papers remain where they are, aligned and complete, their sequence intact but no longer advancing. The lamp continues to cast its steady light, but the clarity it provides now reveals a stillness that does not belong to rest. The telegram lies open. The second document remains beside it. Together they hold the center of the room, not through movement, but through presence. Their stillness has become the defining condition, shaping the space around them without altering its structure. The system, once sustained entirely through repetition, now exists within this stillness, unable to continue without acknowledging what has already entered. You observe the way the hand lowers slightly, not yet committing to action, but no longer fully withdrawn. The motion is small, controlled, yet it carries a weight that was not present before. It does not belong to the sequence of documents. It exists outside it, within the narrowing space that has formed between continuation and response. Outside, the waiting holds, but the stillness has deepened into something that feels complete. The figures remain in place, their endurance sustained, their positions unchanged. The line no longer shifts. It no longer adjusts. It exists as a fixed condition, one that cannot extend further without altering its nature. The doorway remains closed, its boundary intact, but the space around it has taken on a finality that was not present before. Inside, the room holds its breath. The system remains. The documents are still. The sequence has paused. And within this pause, the presence of instruction no longer exists as something that can be moved around. It has settled fully into the space, defining the limits of what can continue without change. The hand moves, not toward the next document in the sequence, not toward the repetition that has defined every action so far, but toward the space between the documents and the instruction. The motion is deliberate, though it carries no visible urgency. It does not break the order of the desk. It does not disturb the alignment of the papers. It exists within the same controlled movement that has guided every action, yet it no longer belongs to the same pattern. You sense the shift not as a break, but as a transition that has been forming over time, now reaching a point where it can no longer remain unexpressed. The system does not collapse. It does not resist. It remains, as it always has. But it no longer defines the space entirely. The instruction does not change. It does not repeat. It remains, as it always has. But it no longer exists alongside continuation without consequence. Outside, the waiting persists, unmoving, complete. Inside, the room holds the convergence of all that has continued. And within that convergence, the act that follows will not be defined by repetition. It will be defined by relation. The hand comes to rest. The space holds. And the moment, sustained for so long through continuation, now exists on the edge of something that cannot be contained within the system that has carried it this far. Not yet resolved, but no longer able to remain unchanged. The act repeats. The room does not release the moment all at once. It allows it to unfold in the same measured way that has defined every action within it, as though even this shift must pass through the same quiet structure before it can fully take form. The hand, having come to rest, does not withdraw. It remains within the space it has entered, neither returning to the sequence nor abandoning it entirely. The desk holds its order. The papers remain aligned. The lamp continues to cast its steady light. Nothing appears altered. And yet, the conditions within which everything exists have changed. The next document lies within reach. It is no different in form from those that have come before it. Its edges are clean, its structure familiar. It carries the same expectation of completion, the same place within the sequence that has defined the system from the beginning. And yet, it is not immediately taken. The hand lingers, suspended within the narrowing space that now separates continuation from response. You observe the way the motion begins, slowly, deliberately, not as a return to what has already been established, but as something that moves through it. The document is lifted, aligned beneath the light, positioned with the same care that has guided every action so far. The movement does not break the system. It passes through it. The ink meets the paper. The line begins. At first, nothing appears different. The stroke follows its familiar path, forming letters that maintain their clarity, their structure, their quiet precision. The act resembles every action that has come before it. The system holds, at least in form. The movement continues, guided by the same control, the same measured pace. But something within the line has changed. It does not follow the structure entirely, not in a way that can be immediately seen, but in a way that alters its relation to what surrounds it. The writing continues, each letter formed with care, each movement consistent, yet the sequence no longer belongs entirely to the system that defined it. The line exists within the framework, but it does not conform to it fully. It carries something beyond the repetition that has sustained every document so far. The hand does not hesitate. It continues. The document fills. The motion remains steady. And yet, The act no longer exists solely as continuation. It has become something else. Outside, the waiting holds, unchanged in form, yet now connected to something within the room that has begun to move beyond its previous boundaries. The figures remain in place, their endurance sustained, their positions fixed. The line does not shift. It does not advance. But the condition that holds it has begun to align with something that is no longer contained entirely outside. Inside, the writing continues. Another line forms. Another follows. The structure remains visible, but it no longer defines the act completely. You sense the shift not through what is seen, but through what is carried within the motion itself. The hand does not stop. The ink does not falter. The document is completed. It is set aside with the same care as all the others. And yet, it does not belong to the same sequence. Not entirely. The next document is drawn into place. The motion repeats. The movement does not resolve itself after the first deviation. It continues, returning to the same familiar gestures, the same careful alignment of paper beneath the light, the same controlled motion of the hand as ink meets the page. Nothing in the form of the action suggests rupture. The system appears to hold. The desk remains ordered. The documents continue to move. The lamp casts its steady, unwavering glow. And yet, the act has changed. The next document follows the same path as the last. It is lifted, positioned, and read with measured attention. The hand begins again, forming lines that resemble those that came before. The structure is present. The motion is precise. But the writing no longer exists solely within the boundaries that define it. It carries something beyond the repetition that once contained it completely. You observe the way the act repeats, not as a return to what has already been established, but as a continuation of what has begun to shift. Each document is completed in the same manner, each page set aside with the same care, and yet the accumulation no longer forms a uniform sequence. There is a subtle difference, not visible in isolation, but present in the way each completed page now relates to the others. The telegram remains open. The second document lies beside it. Their presence has not diminished. It has deepened, shaping the space in which the work now unfolds. They do not interrupt the process. They do not need to. Their existence has already altered the conditions under which continuation occurs. Outside, the waiting persists, but the stillness has begun to align with what is taking place within the room. The figures remain in place, their endurance unchanged, their positions fixed. The line does not move forward. It does not retreat. It holds, sustained through the same quiet persistence that has defined it from the beginning. A slight shift occurs near the doorway, though it does not disrupt the balance of the space. The door opens briefly, allowing a figure to pass through, then closes again with the same quiet finality as before. Those outside do not press forward. They remain where they are, their waiting no longer shaped by immediate change, but by something that extends beyond the moment. Inside, the hand continues. Another document is completed. Another is drawn into place. The sequence persists. But the act of writing has now become something that repeats with difference. The motion remains the same. The structure remains visible. But the relation has changed. Each new document carries forward what began with the first deviation, extending it not through a single act, but through repetition that no longer conforms entirely to the system that sustains it. You sense the shift not as a break, but as a continuation that moves in a different direction while appearing unchanged. The system remains. The instruction remains. But the act now moves between them, no longer contained by either. Outside, the waiting holds, deep and unmoving. Inside, the work continues, steady and controlled. And within the space that connects them, the repetition has become something sustained, something extended, something that no longer returns to what it was. The act repeats, and in repeating, it continues to move further from the structure that first defined it. The last pages. The room holds its shape, but the sense of continuation that once defined it has begun to thin, not through any visible depletion, but through the quiet understanding that what has been sustained cannot extend indefinitely. The desk remains ordered. The lamp continues to cast its steady light. The papers still move, one by one, through the same careful process. And yet, the accumulation has reached a point where each new document no longer adds to an open sequence. It adds to something that is nearing its limit. The hand continues its motion. Another page is lifted, aligned, completed, set aside. Another follows. The rhythm persists, but it no longer carries the same depth of continuation. It feels measured now, not by repetition alone, but by what remains possible within the narrowing space that has formed over time. The pauses between actions remain, but they no longer expand. They hold at a consistent length, as though the process has found a boundary it cannot extend beyond. The telegram remains open. The second document lies beside it. Their presence has not changed, but the way they occupy the room has. They no longer press against the process in the same way. They have become part of the condition itself, integrated not through absorption, but through permanence. The instruction they carry no longer competes with the act of writing. It defines the space within which it occurs. You observe the way the completed documents now rest on the desk, how their number has grown beyond what can be easily contained within a single view. They extend outward, forming a presence that is no longer just the result of repetition, but the record of something that has continued beyond its expected boundary. Each page contributes to this presence, not through variation, but through persistence. Outside, the waiting remains, though it has taken on a quieter, more settled form. The figures still stand, their positions unchanged, their endurance sustained. But the line no longer feels as though it is holding itself in anticipation. It has moved beyond that. It exists now as something that has already endured, something that no longer measures its condition through the possibility of change. The doorway remains closed. It does not open. It does not signal. But the space around it has shifted in a way that suggests something is nearing completion, not through action, but through the duration that has already passed. Inside, the hand continues. Another document is completed. Another is drawn into place. The sequence holds. But the act now carries a quiet finality, not in any single motion, but in the way the continuation no longer feels open. Each page that is completed brings the process closer to something that cannot yet be named, but can be felt in the way the room no longer expands to accommodate more. The ink flows as it always has. The lines are formed with the same precision. The movement remains controlled. And yet, the continuation now unfolds within a space that has already begun to close. You sense the quiet approach of an end that does not arrive suddenly. It does not interrupt. It does not declare itself. It forms gradually, through the simple fact that the process has continued long enough to reach its boundary. The hand pauses, not longer than before, but with a different weight. The next document remains untouched for a moment. The space holds, and within that space, the act of continuing no longer feels infinite. It feels complete in a way that does not require a final action to confirm it. The pause does not extend into stillness, but it carries a clarity that was not present before. The hand lowers once more, returning to the sequence with the same measured control, yet the motion now unfolds within a space that no longer feels open. The document is lifted, aligned beneath the light, and read with quiet attention. The ink meets the page, forming lines that remain consistent, steady, unchanged in their structure. The act continues, but it does so with a quiet understanding that continuation has reached its limit. The papers on the desk have grown into a presence that cannot be easily contained. They extend outward in ordered stacks, their alignment preserved, yet their number exceeding the space that once held them without strain. The desk remains steady, but it now supports something that has moved beyond simple accumulation. Each completed page contributes to this presence, forming a record of repetition that has carried the process beyond its original boundaries. The telegram remains open. The second document lies beside it. Their presence has settled fully into the room, no longer pressing against the work, no longer standing apart from it. They exist as part of the condition that now defines the space, their instruction no longer competing with the act of writing, but shaping the limits within which it has continued. The difference between instruction and action has been held long enough that it no longer requires tension to be felt. It has become part of the structure itself. Outside, the waiting holds, though it has softened in a way that does not reduce its presence, but changes its tone. The figures remain where they are, their endurance sustained, their positions fixed. But the stillness now carries a quiet release, not through movement, but through the way the condition has been held long enough to begin to settle. The line does not disperse. It does not advance. It remains, but its weight has shifted from anticipation to something more reflective, more contained. The doorway remains closed. It does not open. It does not signal. And yet, the space around it no longer feels as tightly held as before. The boundary remains, but the tension that once defined it has eased, not because the condition has changed, but because it has reached a point where it can no longer deepen. Inside, the hand completes another document. It is set aside with the same care as all the others. The next page is drawn into place, though the motion now feels lighter, not in effort, but in relation. The act no longer carries the same weight of continuation. It has moved beyond that. It exists within a space that has already fulfilled what it could sustain. You observe the way the sequence continues, though it no longer feels necessary in the way it once did. The documents are still completed. The ink still flows. The hand still moves with steady control. But the process now exists within a condition that has already reached its natural conclusion. The pauses between actions remain, but they no longer hold tension. They hold recognition. The telegram does not change. The instruction remains. But its presence no longer defines what will happen next. It defines what has already occurred. You sense the shift not as an ending, but as a completion that has formed through continuation rather than interruption. The system has not broken. The instruction has not been followed in form. And yet, something has taken place within the space between them that has reached its full extent. Outside, the waiting persists, but it no longer carries the same weight. Inside, the work continues, but it no longer carries the same necessity. And within the room, the quiet accumulation of pages, of pauses, of sustained motion, has formed something that does not require a final act to confirm it. The hand lowers once more. The document is completed. It is set aside, and the space that follows does not close. Epilogue. After the desk. The room no longer holds the same weight, though nothing within it has been removed. The desk remains where it stood, its surface still marked by the quiet traces of use. The lamp is no longer lit, its absence revealing the way light now enters from outside, softer, less controlled, spreading across the space without defining it. The papers are no longer moving. They rest in stillness, their alignment preserved, their presence unchanged in form, yet altered in the way they now belong to the past of the room rather than its present. The air feels different, not lighter, but released. What once held the space in a state of continuation has settled into something that no longer requires motion to exist. The sequence has ended without a final act. It has simply ceased to continue. The absence of movement does not feel abrupt. It feels complete, as though the process has reached a point where continuation is no longer needed to sustain what has already been formed. Outside, the street no longer holds the same stillness. The figures are gone. Not all at once, not in a way that could be easily marked, but gradually, through the quiet dispersal that follows a condition that has been held long enough to release itself. The line no longer defines the space. The wall stands alone again, its surface uninterrupted. The doorway remains, unchanged in structure, yet no longer surrounded by the presence that once gave it meaning. You stand at a distance from the building now, observing it as part of a larger landscape that has continued to move forward. The city has resumed its rhythm, its sounds no longer muted by the weight of waiting. Movement passes through the street with the same quiet continuity that existed before, but without the stillness that once held it in place. Time has moved. Not quickly, not visibly, but enough. The room, the desk, the papers, the waiting, they remain, not as active conditions, but as something that has already occurred, something that does not require repetition to maintain its presence. What was sustained through continuation has become fixed through memory, carried forward not by motion, but by the quiet understanding that it took place. Chiune Sugihara is not present here as a figure to be followed, nor as a voice to be heard. The actions that pass through the room do not linger as events. They exist in the space between what was required and what was done, in the quiet persistence that allowed something to continue beyond the limits that defined it. There is no single moment that holds the meaning, no final page, no clear division between before and after, only the accumulation of what was sustained long enough to become something else. The desk remains, the papers remain, the space remains, but the condition has changed. You feel it not as a conclusion, but as a quiet shift in the air, the way stillness returns after something has passed through it, leaving no visible trace, yet altering everything that follows. The light moves across the room without resistance now. The walls hold their shape without pressure. The space no longer asks anything of what remains within it. And in that quiet, something endures, not as motion, not as instruction, but as the memory of a moment that did not break, did not stop, did not announce itself, and yet moved steadily and without return into something that cannot be undone. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.